Each time something slipped, I just kept quietly adjusting the standard. I didn't think of it as lowering the bar. It felt more like protecting the story I was telling myself. But looking back, I could see that I was constantly redefining what functional meant just to keep the label intact.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Today I want to talk to you about the truth about being a functional alcoholic. Now, the idea of a functional alcoholic exists for a reason. It didn't show up out of nowhere. A lot of people who drink too much are still getting up every day and going to work. They're paying their bills. They're showing up for family stuff. From the outside, life looks pretty intact. And because of that, it creates a lot of confusion. You could tell something isn't quite right with your drinking, but at the same time, nothing has fully fallen apart yet. And maybe you have seen some consequences, but you feel like you've handled them. Maybe you got a DUI, but you switched to Uber. Told yourself you solved that problem. Maybe you lost a job, but you found another one right away. Told yourself that the old job just wasn't a good match. So now you're thinking, yeah, that wasn't great, but I adjusted. When that's the situation, your brain starts trying to make sense of the gap between this probably isn't healthy and my life is still technically working. And functional alcoholic starts to feel like the most accurate description. It gives you a way to acknowledge that something might be off without having to fully face what that might mean. And people want that to be true, not because they're lying to themselves on purpose, but because it feels safer. If you're still functional, then you don't have to change anything right now. You don't have to make a big decision. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone else. You could tell yourself that you'll deal with it later if it actually becomes a real problem. And it also feels a lot easier than the word alcoholic. That word carries a lot of weight. It sounds permanent. It sounds like something you don't come back from. So adding the word functional in front of it softens it. The same way calling a lie a little white lie makes being dishonest not feel quite as harsh. And it's not just something we do to ourselves either. A lot of the world around us reinforces this idea. We live in a culture that doesn't really care how you're doing as long as you're producing. If you're showing up to work, getting things done, paying your bills, and not causing any problems, most people don't ask any questions. In some environments, drinking heavily is almost expected. It's how people blow off steam. It's how they network. It's how they cope with stress. And if you're still holding everything together, your drinking doesn't just get ignored. Sometimes it gets normalized or even encouraged. People say things like, we work hard and play hard, or at least you're not hurting anyone, or everybody drinks like that. And the people closest to you might lean into that idea too, not because they don't care, but because it makes things easier. If you're still functional, then nobody has to worry. Nobody has to have that uncomfortable conversation. Nobody has to think about what might need to change. So the label doesn't just protect you from your own fear, it protects everybody else from theirs. As long as you're still functioning, the story still works. And once a story works, it's very easy to keep telling it. And I understand why it's appealing. I used that label myself for a long time. But what I want to do today is slow this whole idea down and look at it honestly. Not to judge anyone and not to tell you what you should do, but to talk about what being a functional alcoholic usually looks like in real life once you stop just going by the label. So when we talk about the truth about being a functional alcoholic, I think the first thing to be honest about is what most of us actually mean when we say that. For me, I never wanted to be a normal drinker. I didn't want to control my drinking. The idea of coming home from work, having one or two drinks while watching the evening news, and then going to bed never appealed to me at all. I liked to get drunk. What I wanted was to be able to drink as much as I wanted and still be responsible. I wanted all the fun and none of the consequences. And in my head, that's what being a functional alcoholic meant. And I think this part matters because a lot of people hear conversations about drinking and assume the goal is moderation. Like the problem is that you just haven't had to figure out how to drink the right way yet. That was never my goal. I didn't want to have one or two drinks. I didn't want to sip something slowly and then stop. That version of drinking never made sense to me, and honestly, it didn't sound enjoyable. What I wanted was the feeling. I wanted the release. I wanted the switch in my brain that made everything feel lighter and quieter for a while. I wanted to be able to access that whenever I wanted without it costing me anything. So when people would talk about cutting back or controlling their drinking, I didn't relate to that at all. Even when I made an effort, moderation never lasted, and deep down, it wasn't what I was actually after. Being a functional alcoholic felt like the perfect solution. It let me believe I could keep getting what I wanted from alcohol while still being a good employee, a good friend, and a responsible adult. And early on, it really did feel like it was working. Alcohol still felt like it was giving me something. It helped me relax. It helped me socialize. It helped me shut my brain off after a long day. The problem is that over time, what you get from it starts to shrink and what it costs you starts to grow. But when you're focusing on staying functional, it's easy to miss that shift while it's happening. You keep chasing the version of drinking you remember, even as it slowly stops showing up in the same way. That's when functional starts to quietly change its meaning. Because when I first started using that label, I had a pretty basic definition. It meant that I was going to work and I was paying my bills. Life wasn't perfect, but it was working well enough. But as my drinking progressed, that definition started to change. At some point, it wasn't about whether things were going well anymore. It became, well, I've never been fired from a job because of my drinking. Then that turned into, I've never been evicted and I've never had a car repossessed. And eventually, all I could really say is, well, it's not like I'm homeless and begging for money for a drink. Each time something slipped, I just kept quietly adjusting the standard. I didn't think of it as lowering the bar. It felt like more like protecting the story I was telling myself. But looking back, I could see that I was constantly redefining what functional meant just to keep the label intact. And here's another truth that doesn't get talked about much. Being a functional alcoholic is actually really hard work. When I say functional, I don't mean healthy or peaceful. I mean managed. Because managing something is very different than actually living with it. When you're managing your drinking, a lot of the mental energy is already spoken for. You're thinking about when you could drink, how much you could drink, and how you're going to feel the next day. You're planning around it, recovering from it, making small adjustments to keep everything looking okay. Even on days when nothing goes wrong, there's still this background noise, like a low-level tension, like you're always a little bit on edge, even if you can't quite explain why. You're not relaxed, you're vigilant. You're making sure you don't cross certain lines, making sure you still show up, making sure you don't let things slip too far. And that kind of constant monitoring wears you down over time. That's why a lot of functional alcoholics feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. It's not just physical exhaustion. It's a mental load of always managing, always compensating, always keeping things from tipping over. And when that's where most of your energy is going, there isn't much left for the things that actually make life feel full. Creativity, curiosity, growth, real connection. You might still be functioning, but you're not really at ease in your own life. And that's an important distinction. But it wasn't until later that I could see it clearly. When I first got sober, the only car I could afford is a 1985 Toyota Camry that had about 250,000 miles on it. That car was the definition of functional. It started when I turned the key, and it got me from point A to point B most of the time. But it leaked every fluid you could put into a car. I had to top things off constantly just to keep the engine from blowing up. It shook like crazy if I drove faster than about 60, and any drive longer than 30 minutes made my back hurt. Dashboard lights would turn on and off for reasons I never figured out. Keeping that car functional took daily effort, and eventually it wasn't functional anymore. I sold the car to a friend and he failed to maintain it for a few days, and just like that, it was done. That's what being a functional alcoholic feels like over time. From the outside, things might look okay, but internally, everything is under constant strain. You're constantly maintaining, constantly managing. And the longer that goes on, the less energy you have for anything else. Which is why another truth is that functional alcoholic quietly trades growth for stability. You stop asking big questions about your life. You stop dreaming the same way. You don't expect as much from yourself anymore. Not because you don't care, it's because you're tired. And maybe the hardest truth of all is that functional alcoholism often works best on the outside and worst on the inside. From the outside, people might see someone who's holding things together, but at the inside, there's usually anxiety, depression, a sense that something is off, a feeling that you're not really present in your own life. You might technically be functioning, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, you're running on fumes. And that's the part of the truth that most people don't want to hear when they cling to that label, because it keeps them from asking a few uncomfortable questions. And again, this isn't about whether you should stop drinking. That's not the point of this part. The important question is what it is actually costing you. What is it costing you in your life overall? What is it costing you in your relationships with people you care about? What dreams have you given up on or stopped talking about? Are you building the life you actually want, or are you just protecting the one you have? And the last question I'll leave you with is this. Are you okay with this being as good as it gets as a functional alcoholic? And I want to be really clear here. There's no right or wrong answer to that question. This isn't about judging yourself. It's not about labels, and it's definitely not about forcing a decision you're not ready to make. It's just about honesty. Because most real change doesn't start with a big declaration or some dramatic moment. It starts with being willing to look at your life clearly and tell yourself the truth about where you are and where things are actually headed. So this week, here's the challenge. Take some quiet time, not when you're distracted and definitely not when you're scrolling, and sit with that last question. You don't need to answer it perfectly. You don't need to tell anybody else. Just notice what comes up. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that doesn't mean something's wrong. That usually means you're paying attention. You don't have to do anything with that answer today. You don't have to make a decision or draw a conclusion. Just noticing it is enough for now. Awareness always comes up before change, and sometimes that's the most important step. If this episode resonated with you, I'd like you to do two things. Share it with someone who might be quietly asking themselves the same questions, and make sure you do the subscribe, like, and follow thing so you don't miss the new content I release weekly. And until next time, keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.